But the Chancellor insisted his plan would get the UK through an economic storm.
However, Labour are accusing Jeremy Hunt of pickpocketing the country through stealth taxes. The Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, joins us now. Good morning to you. Thanks for joining us this morning. I mean, looking at the reaction in the papers today, it's been described as a Labour budget, having the policies of Brown. Do you back the fact that the general premise here is that there's help for the vulnerable and the wealthier are paying more?
That's not my takeaway from the budget yesterday. There were plenty of things that the Chancellor could have done to make this budget a fairer one. For example, he could have got rid of the non-dom tax status, which means that very wealthy people who make Britain their home are not paying their fair share of tax in Britain. That could have raised billions of pounds a year, and it could have eased some of the pressure on ordinary working people who saw their pockets picked yesterday with a whole range of stealth taxes and council tax increases at the same time that their incomes are already being eroded by double-digit inflation. So I don't recognise that portrayal. I'd say the other crucial thing that was missing in the budget yesterday, which I would have focused on if I had been delivering it as Chancellor, was a serious plan for economic growth, because there's nothing inevitable about the outlook for the UK economy, which sees it shrink next year and barely recover after that. We need a real plan for economic growth built on economic stability, but then also recognising the big opportunities we have as a country in some of the industries of the future, from green industries, life sciences, helping entrepreneurs and startups. We just didn't have any of that yesterday.
So what measures would you put in place, though, so we're clear? What would you have done differently?
Well, if you want to start on the tax side, there are a number of things that they could have done differently. I've already mentioned the non-dom tax status. Yesterday, the Chancellor reduced the surcharge paid by banks at a time that banks are making record profits. He reduced that from 8% to 3%. That was a mistake. We should be asking our banks to pay their fair share of tax, especially at the moment when the public finances are in such a mess because of previous decisions by Conservative governments. The government have been dragged kicking and screaming into doing a windfall tax on the big energy giants, but they're still leaving billions of pounds on the table that are the windfalls of war. And every pound left on the table that they could have got through the windfall tax means higher bills and higher taxes for everybody else. So those are just some of the different choices on tax that I would have made as Chancellor yesterday, which, as I say, could have eased that burden on ordinary working people who once again find that after a Conservative Chancellor gets up to speak, they've got less money in their pockets.
Well, let's talk about some of the things that maybe you did welcome and you think that they got right. Obviously, there was more money for the NHS, which was a positive, more money for schools, which was a positive. We know that benefits are being increased in line with inflation, pensions as well. There must be elements of that you do welcome on the opposition benches.
I think it's a real relief that pensions and those on the lowest incomes, those on universal credit, are going to see their incomes keep up with inflation. But that is all that is happening, just keeping up with inflation. And people want more than just to survive. They want to thrive. And that means a real plan for economic growth to boost living standards. Now, I am hugely confident about the opportunities ahead for our country, because of our industrial heritage, our geography, our great universities, businesses and entrepreneurs. We could be global leaders in some of the industries of the future, but particularly those industries that are going to help us on that energy transition and boost our energy security, from green hydrogen to floating offshore wind, batteries for electric vehicles. But we didn't hear that serious plan for growth yesterday. And that was a big missed opportunity, because in the end, the way that you improve living standards is by getting growth in the economy. And over the last 12 years, our economy has essentially flatlined. And now the forecasts show that in the next 2 years, we're going to have the slowest growth of any of the big industrialised economy. Things don't need to be this way. There's a different path that the country could go on. And it's disappointing that wasn't set out yesterday.
The Chancellor will, of course, point to the factors that you've mentioned, not least the war in Ukraine, which has had such a huge impact on energy prices. The pandemic previous to that, the government supported millions of people in the UK and paid their wages for an extended period. All of those had massive impacts on the coffers that we have. At the same time, the pressures on the NHS that are coming forward, the Chancellor has found £3 billion a year extra to put into the NHS. I mean, obviously, there is still pressure on the NHS, but that has to be welcomed.
It's absolutely true that COVID and the war in Ukraine have put pressures on public finances and living standards here and around the world. But we have in Britain been uniquely exposed to this. And you see that by the forecasts for inflation and for growth over the next couple of years. Of the G7, the big G7 economies, we're forecast next year to have the lowest growth and the highest inflation. And so, you know, while there are global factors, there are unique British things here because of the decisions over the last few years by the Conservative government that have left us in this position. And we're the only big economy that are increasing taxes on working people and cutting public spending going into a recession. You know, that is really worrying and is going to make the outlook for growth and living standards even worse, which is why we saw yesterday those predictions that now show that we're going to have the biggest squeeze in living standards in, well, anyone's lifetime, certainly over 70 years, probably more.
Yeah, but just picking up on the squeeze in living standards, Ben was mentioning the NHS there. Obviously, an issue at the moment is nurses' pay, isn't it? The RCN is saying that nurses have been left 20% off worse in real terms than a decade ago. They are calling for a 17% pay rise and say that strikes will go ahead over the next few days if this can't be resolved. What would you be doing over this? Would you be agreeing to the 17% that they're calling for?
Well, the fact that there are the first ever strikes by nurses, it is a badge of shame for this government. And they do need to work with those trade unions to resolve these disputes, because I think that nurses just feel a lack of respect and not being listened to by this government. It also shows that we need to get a grip of inflation, because I totally understand why nurses, other workers in the public and private sector are demanding higher wages, because they're struggling to make ends meet right now with a higher weekly food shop, higher gas and electricity bills, higher mortgages.
So how much would you give them? How much do you think would be appropriate? They're asking for 17%.
Look, you know that I'm not going to pluck a number out of thin air. This is based on negotiations, but the government need to get serious about those negotiations, because we're seeing nurses and other professionals leave the National Health Service, which is putting it in even greater peril than it already is.
Okay.
I've set out plans to invest in the workforce of our National Health Service with more doctors, nurses, midwives and health visitors.
Yeah.
Under Labour, the cavalry would be coming. We would be investing to reduce the work pressures on those who are already in our National Health Service.
Can I ask you one last question, because I know that we're going to lose you at any moment. We do appreciate your time this morning. There was one of the parts of the Labour manifesto back in 2019 was a 50p super tax rate, super income tax rate of 50p on people earning £125,000 or over, lowering the threshold of the 45p rate as well from 150 down to £80,000. Are those things that you would still stand by were Labour to get into government?
A very simple answer, no. That was our worst election defeat since the 1930s. We've ditched that manifesto. I've already set out some of the priorities for an incoming Labour government, including taxes, to ensure that those with the broadest shoulders pay more. But those plans, those specific plans, we've ditched those. You know, I've already set out on non-doms, on private equity, for example. But everything that was in our 2019 manifesto, we ditched that under Keir's leadership because it lost us an election and we don't want to lose again.
OK. Rachel Reeves, Shadow Chancellor, thanks for joining us this morning.